The Democracy Forum is a not-for-profit organisation founded in 2009 under the patronage of Baroness Nicholson of Winterbourne. Its principal goal was to work for the furtherance of democracy, peace and the rule of law in order to counter religious fundamentalism and intolerance in our global communities. In an increasingly fractured world, this goal continues to be the driving force behind all of the Forum's activities. Lord Charles Bruce is the current president of the Forum. Since its inception, the Forum has hosted and co-hosted seminars on a wide variety of topics relating to democracy and human rights across the world. The Democracy Forum encourages academics, students, journalists and other socially and politically conscious people to attend our seminars and to participate in the question and answer session. Details are available on our website, thedemocracyforumlimited.com.
The Democracy Forum brings you another not-to-be-missed webinar, 72 Years of Chinese Colonial Rule in Tibet. How is Tibet faring after 72 years of Chinese rule? The Democracy Forum's next discussion will question China's policy of forcing a state hegemony on the region's indigenous population, who face denial of religious freedom and a deliberate displacement of their cultural identity. In assessing the impact of China's modernization of Tibet, the panelists will also explore the economic benefits within the context of the environmental damage to the region. To consider these and related issues, please join us for a rigorous and stimulating discussion of this pressing and long-standing issue.
Hello, I'm Humphrey Hawksley and welcome wherever you are in the world to our Democracy Forum debate on an issue that is heartfelt for millions, has been portrayed in literature and Hollywood movies, but remains doggedly stuck in the 1950s when newly formed communist China went in Tibet and took it as its own. 3.5 million people living on the rooftop of the world with 72 years of Chinese colonial rule in Tibet. What do we really think about it? How bad is it? How ignored is it? In all the issues swirling around increasing tensions with China, Hong Kong, Xinjiang, the Indian border, the South China Sea, Taiwan, Tibet now barely gets a mention. To debate this topic, we have a sterling panel of insight. Sikyong Penpa Tsering of the Central Tibetan Administration, Chris Law MP, co-chair of the all-party Parliamentary group on Tibet, Martin Mills from the University of Aberdeen and Dibyesh Anand from the University of Westminster. Democracy Forum Chair Barry Gardiner cannot, alas, be with us today. We will see a short video from him at the end. And as always, to give us the canvas and background of our discussion, we go to the President of the Democracy Forum, Lord Charles Bruce. Lord Bruce, the screen is yours.
Good afternoon. On behalf of the Democracy Forum, I welcome you all to this webinar hosted from London, which will focus on the anomalous and deeply troubling existence of Tibet as an autonomous region of the Chinese state. This is a topic of undeniable international relevance and concern, and I'd like to thank the Forum and its sister publication, Asian Affairs, for regularly giving it the prominence it deserves. I'm very glad that such an eminent group of panelists has been gathered to share their views with us. And I'm particularly grateful to the staff at Tibet House for arranging for the President of the Tibet Central Authority, the Sikyong, His Excellency, the Honourable Penpa, who is visiting the United Kingdom this week and who will address the panel today. And I'm very pleased that Humphrey Hawksley has agreed to act as your moderator to chair the proceedings. The title of our webinar has been chosen deliberately to describe a political system which has evolved over a period of 70 years and continues to exert a level of control over the lives of the indigenous Tibetan people, which clearly is not compatible with the universally accepted language of human and civil rights. Only last month, the Freedom in the World report, published by Freedom House, revealed its 2023 global rankings and identified Tibet as the least free country on earth, in a worse ranking than North Korea, and sharing the bottom spot with South Sudan and Syria. In awarding the lowest possible score, the report assessed the circumstances prevailing in the Tibet Autonomous Region against universally applied criteria, including the electoral process, political pluralism and participation, the functioning of government, freedom of expression and belief, associational and organizational rights, the rule of law and personal autonomy, and the rights of the individual. Perhaps it's unsurprising that Tibet scored only 1 out of 100 points. As the historian Jürgen Osterhammel reminds us, I quote, "Colonialism is not just any relationship between masters and servants, but one in which an entire society is robbed of its historical line of development, externally manipulated and transformed according to the needs and interests of the colonial rulers." Indeed, for over 60 years, criticism of China's subjugation of Tibet, undeniably as a colonial entity, has been aired frequently at the United Nations General Assembly, with resolutions debated and passed to that effect. In 1959, the International Commission of Jurists published the first of 3 reports entitled "The Question of Tibet and the Rule of Law," concluding that China intended, I quote, "to destroy the Tibetans as a separate nation and the Buddhist religion in Tibet." And sponsoring a parallel resolution in 1961, the Irish representative asked the General Assembly, I quote, "How many benches would be empty here in this hall if it had always been agreed that when a small nation fell into the grip of a major power, no one could ever raise their case here. And once they were a subject nation, they must always remain a subject nation." In 2012, to mark the 60th anniversary of the Chinese invasion, the International Campaign for Tibet published a dossier of misrule, concluding that the Chinese state has not only failed in its responsibility to protect the Tibetan people and their rights under Chinese and international law, it has been the primary violator of those rights. Indeed, the unbridled agency of Chinese colonial violation is endorsed by the Tibetan writer Shokdung, who witnessed the 2008 uprising and its grisly aftermath, describing the People's Republic of China as, I quote, "that relentless autocracy which heaps endless cycles of punishment upon us, condemning us to confusion, falsehood, and delusion, encircling us with trickery, deceit, and lies, prodding us with cruelty, violence, and coercion." In May last year, during the first visit to China since 2005 by the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights, Michelle Bachelet drew attention to the treatment of minorities, including Tibetans, and expressed her concern for the denial of international standards of compliance, such as the lack of independent judicial oversight, the deliberate obstruction of human rights lawyers and activists from pursuing their casework, the ubiquity of residential surveillance, and the use of arbitrary detention. In particular, she demanded that, I quote, "the linguistic, religious, and cultural identity of Tibetans should be protected, and that Tibetan people are allowed to participate fully and freely in discussions about their religious life." Coincidentally, the United Nations appointed 4 special rapporteurs to investigate the treatment of human rights in Tibet. Specifically, they were looking at minority issues, cultural rights, the right to education, and the freedom to practice religion. Their report, published in February this year as an open letter to the Chinese government, exposed the cultural alienation of over 1 million indigenous children, cloistered remotely in residential boarding schools, and revealing to the world perhaps the most existential and egregious example of, I quote, "a policy of forced assimilation of the Tibetan identity into the dominant Han Chinese majority through a series of oppressive actions against Tibetan religious and linguistic institutions." Unsurprisingly, perhaps, the Chinese government has yet to respond. And a further review of China's policy of ethnic intolerance was published by the United Nations Economic, Social and Cultural Rights Committee, also in February this year. Channeling the concern of the international community, United Nations Coordinator Kai Muller expressed his committee's frustration at the uncooperative response of the Chinese delegation, concluding that, I quote, questions were not answered, problems were denied, or the now large number of independent reports of rights violations were dismissed as untrue. He added that, I quote, the Chinese government can no longer escape this criticism, especially of its policy in Tibet. It is unfortunate, although perhaps inevitable, that such a conclusion equally could be applied to the behavior of any totalitarian regime from the darkest periods of world history in the 20th century, as George Orwell observed in his novel 1984, where, I quote, every record has been destroyed or falsified, every book rewritten, every picture has been repainted, every statue and street building has been renamed, and every date has been altered. And the process is continuing day by day and minute by minute. History has stopped. Nothing exists except an endless present in which the party is always right. Well, I hope you enjoy listening to the webinar this afternoon. And please, if you have any points or comments, do direct them to the panel through the chair.
Thank you, Lord Charles Bruce. The least free country on earth, the Chinese government can no longer escape this criticism, or can it? For our first speaker, we are very privileged to have His Excellency Sikyong Penpa Tsering, leader of the Central Tibetan Administration, which operates in exile in India. He was born into a refugee camp, but went on to graduate in economics from Madras Christian University and was first elected to office in that government in exile in 1996. Penpa Tsering, give us your thoughts on Chinese colonial rule in Tibet.
Thank you very much, Chairman Humphrey. I also want to thank Lord Charles Bruce and the distinguished panelists on this webinar. 72 years of Chinese colonial rule in Tibet, and we are still surviving. Our movement is still very strong. Of course, there are a lot of questions as to why you don't hear about Tibet much these days. But 72 years, Tibet has been in the forefront. It's not necessary that Tibet always has to be on the highest pedestal when it comes to political issues inside China. It can be Uyghurs, it can be Hong Kongers, it can be Mongolians, it can be Manchurians, anybody. But as long as the perpetrator is the same, the message to the international community is also same. Now, if we reflect back 72 years ago, that was 1951, May 1951. So next month, we are completing 72 years, when we were forced to sign the 17-point agreement under the threat of war. And all the seals of the governments were duplicated in Beijing because the official seals of the government were not with the delegation who went to China. So all these were forced upon us. I'm sure many people will remember that way back in 1950, every time the Tibet issue comes up, there is always another international issue that also competes with the Tibetan case. And at that time, it was the Korean War. And during the Korean War, the world was very busy with the Korean War and nobody realized what was happening inside Tibet. And that was just 3 years after British left India, and India got independence in 1947, and then communist China took over Chinese political leadership in 1949, and 1950 October they invaded Chamdo in eastern Tibet, and a few months after that, six 8 months after that, we were forced to sign the 17-point agreement. Then His Holiness the Dalai Lama tried to live under the 17-point agreement for almost 8 years, where China talked about helping the Tibetans. In the beginning, they were very nice, and people were also carried away by their niceness. But then, after a few years, we realized, and particularly from 1956, when they started bombing the monastery in Litang and tried to collect all the weapons from the general public, then things turned for the worst. And in between, if you remember, His Holiness was also in China in 1954-55, and he saw how Communist China functioned. He met with Mao, he met with Zhou Enlai, he met with all the leaders of that time. And 1956-57, His Holiness was also in India, and he saw how democracy functioned. But even when His Holiness was in India in 1956, maybe we can go back to 1950 or so. When 1950, when China started invading Tibet from the east, His Holiness was on the Indian border in Tromo, or Yatung as it's called, because it would have been easier for him to escape into India. But that also didn't happen. He went back to Lhasa, and then we stayed in Lhasa till 1959. So from 59 onwards, after we came into exile, things started becoming much, much worse inside Tibet, till you can say during Mao's era, up to 1976, till he died. And that was also the end of the Cultural Revolution. So you can imagine how much has been destroyed inside Tibet. We are talking about more than 6,000 monasteries inside Tibet, more than 1.2 million Tibetans having died directly or indirectly because of China's aggression into Tibet. And then after Mao died, Deng Xiaoping took over. He had a little more liberal ideas, and he even said that we can discuss about anything else other than independence. And then we did send some fact-finding delegations into Tibet. We also sent exploratory teams into China to find out whether there could be possible dialogues in 1982 and 84. And then that was, during that period, there was little leniency in Tibet when Deng Xiaoping was in charge, and Hu Yaobang was the premier, and he sent his own people to study the situation inside Tibet, and they realized that it was worse than before the Chinese came into Tibet. So he sent back about 85% of the Chinese cadres, and Panchen Rinpoche was also released. So Panchen Rinpoche and other Tibetan leaders were very, very they took up the mantle of restoring Tibetan language and Tibetan religion within that brief period in the 80s. And then again, Hu Jintao came, and there was martial law in Tibet. And after Deng, Jiang Zemin also followed, and by mid-90s, they were calling His Holiness with all kinds of names, including a Buddhist monk with wolf's clothing or whatever. So all kinds of names attributed to His Holiness. And then by late 90s, they were talking about the Western Development Plan. But the situation inside Tibet was being tightened on every level. And by 2002, we hoped for negotiation. There was contact, and for about 8 years, we hoped that China might give some serious thought on resolution of the Sino-Tibet conflict. But that was a ruse for the Chinese leadership to have no problem when they are organizing the coming out party, the Olympics. And as soon as the Olympics was over, the negotiations or the dialogue also dissipated soon after. And since then, there has never been any dialogue so far from 2010 to 2023 in the last 13 years. And let us see what comes up in the days to come. But then the situation, the result of 72 years of Chinese colonial rule in Tibet, as Lord Charles Bruce put it, the Freedom House had named Tibet as one of the least free countries in the world, along with South Sudan and North Korea. So that itself manifests the situation inside Tibet. If I can briefly say, with we are dying a slow death. Our culture is dying a slow death because all the policies and programs of the Chinese government are aimed at eradication of the Tibetan national identity, whether it be language or whether it be Tibetan culture or religion or way of life or Tibet's environment. So there are so many issues which I won't be able to do full justice in 10 minutes. Of course, there are a lot of other panelists who will also cover. They are all experts on Tibet. I just want to repeat what Lord Charles Bruce mentioned about the book 1984. So what we see in Tibet and in China is the George Orwell's book turning into reality inside, where the state controls everything, every movement. So the Chinese government uses all kinds of artificial intelligence, whether it be electronic identification, whether it be geolocation, or these days now DNA sample collection or iris scanning of Tibetan people. All these are aimed at control, and more control. Whether it's the Tibetans or Uyghurs or the Mongols or Hong Kongers or even the Chinese people. But we suffer more because if you have to travel to Tibet, it's not enough to have just Chinese visa to go to China. You have to have a separate visa to permit to go to Tibet. So in terms of language, if you study Tibetan, there is no possibility to get jobs for you. So you have to think about your livelihood also. And Lord Bruce also mentioned about the UN Special Rapporteur's report on the colonial-style boarding schools inside Tibet. Now, if you point that out to the Chinese, they point at the United States and say, how did they treat their own Indians or the Canadians with the First Nations or the Australians with the Aborigines or the New Zealanders with the Maoris and even the Scandinavians with the Sami people? But they know exactly what happened during those periods. They know that the countries that are responsible are making up to it, but they are using the same tactic to destroy Tibetan national identity inside Tibet. So that is the most unfortunate part. Knowingly, they are destroying it. And then, of course, Tibetan language is also linked to Tibetan Buddhism. And now over the last 70 years, they have been putting more and more stringent rules. The number of monks and nuns have come down drastically from independent Tibet. The movement of monks and nuns, you have to take multi-layer permissions to travel from place to place. All the management committees of the monasteries now have been taken over by state agencies. The curriculums are set up by the atheist government. CCTVs are installed to monitor movements of all the monks, particularly the sensitive monks where political activities have already taken place. And now they want to be responsible for reincarnation of, recognition of reincarnated lamas, what they call as living Buddhas, a law they passed in 2007 called the Order Number 5. Now, because of what China is doing to Tibet today, many Tibetans, as per our statistics, the CTA's official statistics, 157 Tibetans have self-immolated inside Tibet so far from 2009 onwards. There was a time in 1963 when a single monk in Vietnam burned himself to death and it became international news. But even after 157 self-immolations inside Tibet, the Tibetans, hoping against hope that the Chinese government will pay some attention to their plight, or hoping against hope that the international community will come to their rescue, but in vain so far. But I tell the Tibetans, these sacrifices will not go in vain. So that is and these people are mostly young people between 17 to 35 who have never witnessed cultural revolution, who has never witnessed independent Tibet. They only see what the Chinese government is doing to Tibet now. And in terms of political activities, there is no space whatsoever. I mentioned about all the artificial intelligence that the Chinese government has employed in controlling people. And even if now the whole it's designed in such a way that even if I want to self-immolate today, I have to worry more about my near and dear ones. I might die, or I might get scarred for life if I burn myself, but then I have to worry about my immediate family because they are going to suffer. My friends are going to suffer. My family are going to suffer. So this is the gridlock system that the Chinese government has introduced, and it makes it very, very difficult for Tibetans to do anything. It's not because the Tibetans are not facing repression and oppression inside Tibet. It's not as much as the state-engineered industrial scale concentration camps in Uyghur, but the level of the control inside Tibet is so much that now I say we are dying a slow death. In fact, under Xi Jinping, he's talking about one nation, one culture, one religion. Even religion, I say that because they want to give religion every color to the religion with Chinese characteristics. So whether it's Christian or Buddhism or any other religion inside Tibet has to have this Chinese characteristic where the state is able to control the religion. So one language again. So at one time we used to really fear demographic aggression. Of course, there are more Chinese in Tibet than Tibetans, but it's not as much as we fear. So the Chinese are now using a different tactic in the terms of the colonial boarding schools by turning every young Tibetan into a Chinese. They claim that they allow Tibetan dress, Tibetan food and all that, but that's all facade. What they teach is more important. Of course, we are not against education, but then Tibetans are the least educated people in China. Tibetans are the least economically empowered people in China. So we are least in everything. But here, providing education to the Tibetans is okay, but signification of all the Tibetans, if this continues for another 10, 15 years down the line, it's going to have serious consequences for the Tibetans. So therefore, we urge all countries in the West, even here in Europe, I tell them, if you keep repeating the statement that Tibet is part of PRC, you're going against international law because we have only one agreement with the People's Republic of China, that is the 17-point agreement. That was also forced upon us post forceful occupation of Tibet. Then we also tell the governments that if you keep repeating this statement that Tibet is part of PRC on the one hand, and then also on the other hand, the governments keep saying we support negotiations between His Holiness and the representative of Chinese government, representative of His Holiness and the Chinese government, then the very reason for China to come and talk to us has been removed. That is the historical status of Tibet as an independent state. So China rules Tibet with an iron hand, and they are trying to seek legitimacy of its rule in Tibet from the international community. So the third question I always ask governments is, do you have any other country in this world who invaded another country and then ask the whole international community to say that this is part of us? Or in China also, why does China government ask other governments to say that Tibet is part of PRC? Why are they not talking about Manchuria also being part of PRC, or Mongolia or Inner Mongolia or East Turkestan? That is because the Chinese government knows that they have no legitimacy of their rule in Tibet. And we tell the international community, you have no right to give legitimacy to the Chinese government. If there is anybody who can give legitimacy to the Chinese government, it can only be His Holiness and the Tibetan people. Thank you, Humphrey.
Thank you very much for that. And I'd like to take advantage of having you with us. We have a question that's come in from Epsun Yuna, and it's an interesting one because it says actually the cynical excuse and denial of any imperial colonizer is to claim they are bringing modernity and progress.
Yes.
But China has it not, bought modernity and progress? So could you give us a balance between the I don't quite know how the advantages of what China is doing for infrastructure and everything, and the repression that the individuals are feeling?
What I hear about discussions in the upper echelons of Chinese leadership whenever they talk about Tibet is they always stress on how much money they put in Tibet's development. We are also not against development. But again, the question is development for whom? Why are all these railways coming up? Why are all these airfields coming up? Why are all these roads coming up? That is because China is known as the factory of the world. So you have China going to Africa, Latin America, everywhere to feed these factories, to get raw material. And Tibet, of course, is one place where it has never been, Tibet has never been exploited of natural resources. Tibet is a virgin land. So there are so many things that the Chinese have taken away from us, a lot of cultural things. So we are not against development. We are not against materialism, modernization. But the question that we need to ask the Chinese back is, what do Tibetan people really need? Is it just economic development? Or are there other aspirations where Tibetans need to preserve their language and culture and religion? And so which is more important for the Tibetans? That is something that the Chinese government need to understand.
And thank you for that. There are many comments coming in thanking you for being here. What exactly are you doing in England and Europe at the moment?
We try to reach out to governments as much as possible. So during this visit, I will be visiting UK, Scotland, Norway, Denmark, and the last part is Germany. So we try to reach out to as many governments as possible and explain to them, and particularly to the Europeans, we tell them that if we need to contain China, please don't think that US alone is enough. We need more transatlantic cooperation, not competition when it comes to China. We were all responsible for creating this monster called China. So we all have to be, including transatlantic cooperation, along with all other liberal democracies around the world, to come together and make sure that China is made accountable for what they did to the Tibetans and other nationalities.
And President Kumar has asked a question that I think is on everybody's minds a bit. Who will fill the leadership void after His Holiness the Dalai Lama is no longer with us?
There will be a reincarnation of His Holiness. And His Holiness has, if you know our history of democracy, then His Holiness, not even 1 year after coming into exile, when we were going through a lot of difficulties, our people were dying because of heat in India. They were not used to Indian food. But still, His Holiness decided to have representative democracy way back in 1960. And that was all meant to prepare us to take care of our well-being and our political activities into the future. And His Holiness is a true democrat at heart, and he has always been a visionary in that sense, with a lot of foresightedness. So he had prepared the Tibetans to be able to be responsible for themselves when he is not there. So after the demise of this Dalai Lama, there will be another Dalai Lama. And all I can tell the Chinese government is, have you not learned enough lesson from the Panchen Rinpoche's case? Because the young boy recognized by His Holiness the Dalai Lama has disappeared along with his family. Now 34 years old, we don't know whether that young boy is alive or not. There have never been any response, just like Lord Bruce was talking about the UN special rapporteurs not getting any response from the Chinese government. So now my message to them is, whenever that time comes, 20, 25 years down the line, because His Holiness plans to live very long. So one of the things I always tell our Chinese is, let us see whether His Holiness the Dalai Lama outlives the Communist Party or the Communist Party outlives the Dalai Lama. And
we'll keep it.
And just one last word on that, because now I want to tell the Chinese recognized or selected Panchen Lama is not recognized by anybody, whether it's the Tibetans or the neighboring Buddhist countries. So that will be the same case if China chooses a next Dalai Lama, and we will choose our own Dalai Lama. So my message to Chinese government is, do you really need a problem that is going to last a lifetime?
And we'll see which lasts the longer. Before I let you go on this session, and then I want to come back to you before 3:30 when you have to go, can you just encapsulate for us the middle way? Because we're going to be discussing it during this debate. What is the middle way?
The middle way is a Buddhist concept, avoiding polarities, extreme polarities. So here in this case, the one polarity is the status of independent Tibet before communist invasion, and the other polarity is the present state of Tibet under Chinese occupation. So we have to find a middle way there, whereby the Tibetans will have the freedom to preserve and protect and use its languages, culture, and religion, and way of life, and protection of environment.
Okay, thank you for that. That's an excellent encapsulation. Stay with us for as long as you can. We are now going to our next speaker, Chris Law, a Scottish Nationalist MP and the Scottish National Party MP and co-chair of the all-party parliamentary group on Tibet. And he's a politician, of course, who's passionate about Scotland's independence from Britain. So we might find out about how much that has got to do with a colonial power situation. But Chris Law, give us your argument now about 72 years of Chinese colonial rule in Tibet.
Thank you, Humphrey, and thank you for that introduction. I'd also like to thank you, Sikyong, for what he's just talked about there. It's actually given a lot to the background and also what's currently going on. Just a little bit about myself, and it relates to your introduction. I actually think I've supported independence for Tibet longer than I have Scotland. In fact, when I first went to India in 1992, was when I first visited Dharamsala and learned about the plight of Tibetans who were in exile in North India. And I learned the backstory about what had happened with Chinese invasion and subsequent occupation. So my campaign for Tibet has been longer, and I must say it helps to inform also where Scotland's relationship is with the rest of the UK, because the three things that matter that need to be linked up is democracy, human rights, and international law. And if any one of those gets compromised, you can see how all three tend to be interlinked and where all three deteriorate. My role here in the UK is a member of Parliament. I have been for the last 8 years now. It wasn't something I was, many people went into politics planning from a young age. I was quite the opposite. I was a serial entrepreneur, spent a lot of time in India. And actually we had a campaign for independence Scotland in 2014, which really put fire in my belly. And in fact, I joined the all-party group on Tibet in the UK. The UK Parliament was one of the first cross-party groups that I joined, and I have the privilege to co-chair with the Conservative MP, Tim Lawton, who has been the chair for many, many years. I'm also a member on the all-party group in Uyghurs, which helps to inform and keep the debate alive and the campaign alive for Tibet, because as we know, Tibet was a testing and training ground for future repression in the Uyghur region by Chen Quango, who laid out the most surveillant, most repressive regime we've seen anywhere in the world. And I was shocked by what Lord Bruce said at the beginning about from Freedom House, where the UK comes, sorry, not the UK, that Tibet is the least free country on earth. Just to echo a couple of thoughts from the Sikyong. Firstly, I heard testimony from Dr. Gyal Lo, who visited here at the UK Parliament just a few weeks ago from Canada, who had taken many, many testimonies from families right now in Tibet who are losing their young children to these education camps, boarding camps, which are up to 3 months or more at a time. Now, boarding camps around the world are used in various ways, but this is done by the state in a manner that takes children at a very young age. And I'm reminded of what the Sikyong said, which is a slow death. Because what Dr. Gyal Lo told us about was these 4 to 6 year old children being taken away from their families at such a young age and being put into these education camps for 3 months or more at a time to learn as a first language Mandarin, and secondly, to learn about Chinese culture and Chinese politics and the rewriting of Tibet's history. What's most dramatic about hearing about this, shocking as it is what is happening to families on the ground. And it was really humbling to hear what Dr. Lo had to say to us, which was that when these children are going back home, they are withdrawn. They are keeping their families away from them. They feel separated. Any other description would be post-trauma, PTSD, where that time ripped away from their families, which is just utterly shocking and reprehensible and needs to be called out, is unspeakable, frankly. You have these young children, boys and girls, that are going through that period, which is a rupture in their own upbringing, their own love and attention from their family. It's a rupture with their own Tibetan culture and society, with their relatives, and learning the stories, the language, the history of where they're from. So I just wanted to bring that in at this stage. I could touch on the history, but I know there are other speakers. So I really want to talk about where is the UK now, and where do we go forward. I think, sadly, what's happened in the UK over the last 2 decades, particularly when Labour was in power between 1997 and 2010, is this disconnect, political disconnect between the UK's relationship with Tibet. That goes right back to the 1914 Shimla Convention, which was a legal binding relationship of suzerainty, which is a close cooperation and a recognition of Tibet as a sovereign state. And that was decoupled in 2008 by David Miliband, at the time Foreign Secretary, and more or less in a ministerial statement, without any grounds whatsoever to take that away, given the fact of our long-standing, almost 100-year relationship. I think what's exacerbated this, and this is just my own, I could go into great detail, but I know other people I want to speak, and it's really important. It's been exacerbated when the UK government, current UK government, came into power in 2010, when they basically moved away in order to allow this so-called golden era between UK and China, which is supposed to be the decade from 2015, to prosper. And in fact, George Osborne stated at the time at the Shanghai Stock Exchange in 2015, let's create a golden decade for that relationship. And in fact, Theresa May's visit in 2018, when she was Prime Minister, talked about intensifying that. Frankly, this has been done at a time when we were learning more and more about repression in Tibet, and actually starting to hear dreadful reports coming out of Xinjiang province. It was also a time when we had our 2015 National Security Strategy and Strategic Defence and Security Review, which did not even mention China. China was neither mentioned alongside Russia, even although they were going against international law. So to give you an example, Russia had invaded Crimea and annexed eastern Ukraine, yet at the time we were not clear about human rights and international law. That, to give some hope to those listeners that are on this webinar just now, that is changing. I'm not saying at UK government level, but it is changing across the House. There's been a broad coalition of MPs on all sides that have become increasingly disturbed by not only what's happening in Tibet, what's also happening in the Uyghur province, but also in Hong Kong. More has come out in recent times, particularly about surveillance going on here in the UK, these so-called spies that we're having that are popping up across the UK, and where there's been repression put against people who've spoke out against it. 5G mobile home network is now being rolled back, taken out of our networks by 2027 in the UK, and mobile providers will be banned from buying new Huawei 5G equipment by the end of 2020. So the UK has a role. It's one of the biggest buyers of Chinese goods and services, and it's still one of the 5th or 6th largest economies in the world. And what was the Chinese ambassador's response to, for example, the removal of Huawei kit from 5G networks? And I have the quote here. It says, if you want to make China a hostile country, you'll have to bear the consequences. So for those of us who value democracy, human rights, and international law, that should be crystal clear that that's a direct threat. and that's also a threat to national security. So speaking up against China is the minimum we can do, but we should be calling out each and every time people's either within the territory of China or occupied by China who are finding that their democracy, their human rights, and where breaches of international law are happening should be called out. There is now, in the last year or so, in fact, this year, the UK government in March last month published a refresh integrated review, and now is starting to look at what's China's role in the world. You know, the problem, I spoke last Thursday, I led a debate in Parliament on Palestine, and I said 3 words, that silence is complicity. So when we sit quiet thinking, well, we need to do this in terms of economic interests of the UK, or we need to be silent because we don't want to offend the CCP, or we need to do this in order to foster whatever else. If it's at the expense of others, and I'll go back to my key point, we undermine our own democracy, their value in human rights and international law. And as we're seeing now with the flexing of the muscles by Chinese military, particularly in the Taiwan Straits, they're serious about their intent for the future. Taiwan is also a democracy just off the eastern coast of China, which is facing almost daily military threats now. People in Taiwan are preparing for a potential military invasion. They're going through air raid alarms, they're preparing for what will happen next. And so the time we have wasted, and I'll just go back to the Sikyong who just pointed out, is we are all responsible and we all have a duty to call out the rights of people all over the world when we see it being compromised. And Tibet is the biggest example of it anywhere. What I would say going forward, which hopefully is an optimistic note, is that Tim in particular, Tim Lawton, introduced to Parliament a reciprocity bill, which I, along with my cross-party colleagues, will be putting pressure on to see that be enacted. It's similar to the one in the the US, which means that we look at the size of the delegations that have been allowed to come to the UK, and if that is even remotely being reciprocated to go into Tibet. I should add that 3 times as many delegations come to the UK than what there is going to China, in particular Tibet. And many of our colleagues, including Tim Lawton, have even been sanctioned as a result of speaking out against Tibet. For whatever reason, they haven't sanctioned me yet. I'm sure my time will come. I would wear it as a badge of honour. And for those who have been sanctioned, I know they have, and it's very important. But now is the time to put pressure on the UK to act. It has a historical relationship with Tibet that goes back 100 years. We should be looking at suzerainty being restored. We should be speaking out at each and every opportunity about Tibet, whether it's connected to Hong Kong, the Uyghurs, Taiwan, or Tibet directly, and we should push forward for that act. And I'll stop now because I know Humphrey's on screen here, looking at me, knowing there's other papers to come. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Chris. Well, I'd like you to clarify something that struck me when you were talking about the brainwashing of children, essentially, by taking them away in Tibet. We've heard a lot about this in Xinjiang, but this is a similar situation, is it? Could you give us the differences and similarities of what is going on there?
So, what can I say? So I went back to the point about since 2008, since the biggest uprising in Tibet against the reduction in basic human rights, that the Chen Quango, who was in charge of Tibet at the time, basically escalated every opportunity, ratcheting up every opportunity to reduce those rights. It has been an experimental ground. And it's only in recent year or two I've started to hear it being debated. Well, look, this is now the same person who's in charge of the Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region since 2016, and he's rolling out and replicating the lessons learned in Tibet, which includes these mass detention centers. In terms of education side, they call them re-education camps. I can't talk to the information or the lack of information of 4 to 6 year olds, but we do know that those who are in these re-education centres, and we have repeatedly individual horrendous tales told to you in Parliament, of people basically being taught that their own culture, their own society, their own history is either wrong or untrue, and the one China, if you want to be part of China, it is this way, because there is no other way, and that is the way it's to be. So what has been happening in Tibet for quite some time under Shenguanggu is now happening in the Uyghurs. And if we don't stand up to it now, we're going to see it replicate again and again elsewhere. And my very last point, Humphrey, sorry, is that China's not exclusive in this. Other countries are watching, listening, and learning. And so it's imperative. So Tibet's voice is imperative because, frankly, it's the first country where that grand experiment went on, from occupation to completely trying to rewrite its entire history and its future.
Yeah, it's thank you for that. I want to ask you secondly about the middle way, and like the Sikyong's view of your answer to that, because of your SNP hat, as it were, and independence hat. If you have the extremities that you've got in Tibet and the kind of devolution or autonomy that you've got in Scotland, where would you think the middle way with Tibet would be with those two bookends, as it were?
I think that's a great question, Humphrey, you've asked, because the UK has got 3 devolved parliaments, Scotland being one of them, and devolution is quite unique in the UK compared with other federal systems elsewhere in the world. I think so long as the lessons I'm learning and have learned from devolution is this, that so long as if this is to be a middle way approach where there is a powers to be reserved under the CCP, under China, and devolved powers, which are whether it be over education, health, multi-faith, whatever it might be. The key point of this is it has to be made sure it's enshrined from the beginning, so it's a relationship of equals. Just to give one example, democracy in Scotland is being currently eroded on a number of levels. We now find out we're unique in the world, Scotland is, of having no legal route to having the democratic expression of whether it wishes to be independent in the future or not. We know that from the Supreme Court ruling last November. And even although we have a majority in Parliament in Scotland for independence, you've got a coalition. I think the second thing is in terms of your relationship in the world, you need to make sure, and Sikyong doesn't need to be told this because he knows it already, is to reach out and continuously talk to your international partners at a national level. In the last week, I've asked a question in Parliament, why is it the UK thinks it's okay to tell our UK ambassadors to tell the world that Scotland cannot interact directly through Scottish ministers for the Scottish Parliament, which I find frankly appalling, and I'll be writing to those UK ambassadors in time, not least because that partnership is paid for by all sides. So if the middle way is to look at devolution, I'm more than happy to give you some of the lessons that we have learned and are learning as I speak.
Sikyong, Penpa, Tsering, if you're still here and across that, which I hope you are, could you comment on what Chris Law has just said?
Now, I think His Holiness is always thinking about the common interests rather than individual interests, whether it's an individual person or a community or a country or a nationality within that. So His Holiness has said this many times, and His Holiness has also said Scotland is an example for us to get devolved power in terms of autonomy, and South Tyrol is another example that we were looking at as an autonomous state. So, of course, what will come out will depend a lot on how China sees that. So we will have to keep working on it until we are able to reach a resolution on the Sino-Tibet conflict with the government of China. We will keep continuing to reach out to the international community, whether they like it or not. It's a different matter. So all I can say is the Tibetan spirit inside Tibet is still very much alive, even after 72 years. And we tell the Europeans, please don't look at us only from the perspective of a victim of communism. If you can look at us as partners to bring about positive changes inside China in the future, then you need both internal and external forces. And we are the internal forces, the Tibetans, the Uyghurs, the Mongols, the Hong Kongers. And if you want to include the Taiwanese also, they are also facing the same problem. So if we want to bring about changes, then we need collective responsibility of everybody, including Tibetans, Uyghurs, and Mongols and Hong Kongers.
Okay, that is the interesting, the Tibetan-Scotland link, and you're heading up to Scotland, aren't you?
Yes, I am.
Yeah, that's very. We're going to leave that there. But any thoughts on this fascinating middle way? How far to go? There is a thought that as you were speaking there, that crossed my mind. That of course, if you give too much devolution, the next thing they want is independence. And we have a question here which we can think about from Chanda Bahadur as, will Tibet regain its independence, and what would need to change in order for that to happen? Let's return to that in a moment, but right now I'd like to go to our next speaker, Dr. Martin A. Mills, Senior Lecturer in Anthropology at the University of Aberdeen in Scotland and Director of the Scottish Centre for Himalayan Research. He specialises in the comparative organisation and structure of governance in religious, state and medical institutions, and he is the author of Identity, Ritual and State in Tibetan Buddhism. Martin Mills is going to dig deeper for us into the middle way policy, which actually carries the endorsement of the White House as a means to protect Tibetan identity. But Martin Mills is going to tell us what the challenges are to make it work. The screen is yours.
Humphrey, thank you. That's very kind. Yes, I'd like to perhaps follow up on that question that we were just asked about, what is involved kind of in a sense in the future, particularly supporters of Tibet, and I count myself as a supporter of Tibet. I first went to Tibet in 1986. I was a tender stripling of 19 years old and happened to stay there quite by accident for about 6 months. Completely fell in love with the place, the language, the culture, the religion, and have been extremely fortunate to actually basically make a career out of it. And this is very good, and it allows me to do this kind of thing. But over that period of life, from 1986 to now, one has seen a gradual decline and a gradual, the Sikyong referred to it as a kind of slow death of Tibetan culture across the board. The situation has definitely got colder. The place of Tibetans and their capacity for political agency has clearly reduced over that period of time. And that has occurred most dramatically, in particular, in the last 20 years. And it raises this kind of question of, well, what does one do about this? How do Tibetans in exile, what do they do? How do people like me, what do we do? How do we look forward to this in the future? And I think, there have been so many answers on the board that we need to think kind of very carefully about this. And we need to think very carefully about the Tibetan government in exile's middle way policy. This is a policy that was formulated in 1988. It followed on from the Strasbourg proposal and His Holiness's 5-point peace plan. And effectively speaking, it sought to endeavor to negotiate with the People's Republic of China and the Chinese Communist Party genuine autonomy for Tibetans and Tibet within the People's Republic of China. Now, this was a distinct move away from the previous goal of full independence. It was seeking instead something closer indeed to the Scottish model, a self-governance of Tibetans, of internal Tibetan affairs, while leaving the PRC largely in charge of external relations, foreign affairs, military, those kinds of things. And I think the essence of this puzzle is the question of self-determination as the UN understands it. This is the determination to choose and to have agency over one's own life, over one's own culture, over one's own religion, over one's own language, all of these kinds of things. I would say that there is a realpolitik to this to a certain extent. I mean, a quick look at the Tibetan plateau on any world map will give people a kind of context to the middle way policy. Tibet, in case you didn't know, is a very large place. It's about 1 million square miles, and that makes it the size of Western Europe. It's it dominates the center of Asia. Most of it is about 4,000 meters of altitude. And it's an actually huge place. It takes up a quarter, pushing towards a third of the People's Republic of China itself. But in the end of the day, it is a country of 6 million people with limited infrastructural capacity, largely because precisely of the harshness of the environment that Tibetans are used to live in, that Tibetans have thrived in, that the Tibetan civilization has grown up in really over the last 1,300 years since, depending on precisely how you count the beginning of Tibetan civilization. We could go back a lot further than that. But generally speaking, the city of Lhasa was founded in the 7th century under Songtsen Gampo, the first emperor, the first Buddhist emperor. And we're looking at a civilization gradually dying off within a single lifetime, within my lifetime, within the lifetime of everybody on this panel. And this is, for the world, is a horrifying thing. If we think about words like diversity and things on those lines, the truth of the matter is the human race going forward isn't doing a brilliant job, and we need as many diverse voices to add to the possible mix of solutions that are available to us as much as we can. Now, the problem that Tibet has, as far as full independence is concerned, is simply this. It is a large area. The Tibetan population is relatively small. It shares a sparse, largely unpopulated sort of borderland of about 4,000 kilometers with the Chinese mainland. And on the other side of that, you have one of the most powerful economies in the world. It's got a standing army of 2 million. It's got a population 230 times the size of the Tibetan population. The Tibetan plateau is landlocked on all sides, and it's bounded, particularly in the south and the west, by the Himalayas and the Karakoram, by these huge mountain ranges that makes it very inaccessible to, for example, foreign journalists and so on, unless people are allowed to go there. And so in all of these senses, there is no conventional solution to the Sino-Tibetan puzzle. This isn't something one could do, Q8 1991. One can't liberate in that way. There are no ports. There are nothing of that kind, And even if you did, your answer to this would be, your long-term solution would be a gradual kind of collapse, like in places like Afghanistan. And so in this sense, the cumulative reality of all of this is that the political position of Tibet cannot be resolved in any peaceful, stable, and sustainable way without the agreement and indeed the willing cooperation of China. Simply put, peaceful coexistence requires peaceful and willing cooperation. And it is that simple reality, which you can't get rid of because the geography just stands against it, that stands at the heart of the middle way policy. That said, let's be really clear here. The middle way policy is a negotiating stance. It is a goal. It isn't actually a strategy. All right? A strategy is a larger thing than that. How, after all, do you bring the Chinese Communist Party to the table? What is involved in that? Now, there is, of course, a strategy as far as that's concerned. That is largely to use Tibet's undeniable moral case to generate enough international diplomatic consensus and pressure to bring the PRC to the negotiating table and accept the genuine autonomy position. Now, in the 1980s, that sounded feasible. Tibetan government in exile certainly lacks the kind of conventional resources that might be required for any conventional solution to this problem. I use conventional in the nasty sense of the word. But as a consequence, it is generally tended to use unconventional sources. By and large, these are kind of fivefold. Let's quickly run through them. The personal authority and charisma of His Holiness the Dalai Lama, number one, and probably the most important. Secondly, the groundswell of underlying intergenerational support, loyalty, and courage of the Tibetan people, particularly those inside Tibet, to protest. Thirdly, the general popularity of Tibetan Buddhism, for example, particularly amongst the middle classes of Europe and America, many of whom had a chance to see Tibet itself in the 1980s and the 1990s, as I did. The fourth is the moral case of Tibetans as victims of military aggression, state oppression, and human rights abuses. And finally, indirect Western support derived from Tibet's positioning in the late 20th century Cold War. Now, as I say, in the 1980s and 1990s, these combined to present a really formidable presence on the world stage for such an infrastructurally poor, resource-poor movement. However, most of these resources have dwindled over time. His Holiness, as a natural function of the passage of years, which I'm afraid will come to all of us, has retired. And is not physically capable of the kind of extraordinary political and international omnipresence that he was capable of 30 years ago. The PRC has undoubtedly grown stronger, more strident, and more confident in that time, particularly in economic and infrastructural terms. Now, we can discuss the question of how stable that strength is, and that's another matter. There are many who argue that that strength in large part derives from the fact that it actually has to force west across the Tibetan plateau and across Xinjiang in terms of its infrastructural withdrawing, its extractive withdrawing of resources, precisely because to a certain extent it is running out. But we'll put that aside for the moment. During this time, as a consequence of all of that, it has deployed enormous security resources to close down access to Tibet, to close down the capacity of anybody else to experience the conditions there, to break the intergenerational transfer of culture, religion, and language amongst Tibetans and Tibetan communities inside Tibet. That's through criminalization, through employment policies, through patriotic education campaigns, mass relocations, and most recently, the sending of the young to state boarding schools away from their families. The other shift here is, of course, is that the political polarities of the Cold War have been complicated by the end of the Soviet Union and the rise of China as a main bulwark of industrial capitalism in the world. The final change that has really kind of cooled things to a certain extent is a more subtle one, and it's just that the general political currency of moral victimhood and human rights accusations, which were really at their height in the 1980s, have, for a variety of reasons, been significantly devalued on the international stage in the last 2 decades. Now, as a consequence of all of these factors, active diplomatic support for the Tibetan cause has undoubtedly dramatically narrowed in the last 20 years, and that is a very, very significant challenge for Dharamsala. To the extent to which, to a certain extent, actually, it has become largely secondary, if at all, to media accounts of issues in Xinjiang. And the Uyghurs of Xinjiang used to look to Dharamsala as actually a kind of model for a successful campaign. Now, all of that should kind of give us a bit of a pause, because the question is not really whether or not the middle way, which is sometimes controversial amongst Tibetans in particular that think full independence is the way forward. But it's not about the goal. The goal actually, to my thinking, always made sense. The real question is the strategy you use if the resources have changed. The strategy you use to get to your goal, if those resources have changed and shifted, as they have over 30 years, over almost 40 years now, actually pushing close to it. If those resources have changed, then one does need to rethink. And rethinking this question is one in which you cannot use, as it were, the dogmas of the quiet past, the dogmas of the Cold War in this case, which was less than quiet, to really think about the stormy present. We are in a new situation now, and this requires Tibetans and those that are interested in Tibet and those who find it a profound anomaly in the modern world in legal and democratic and autonomous terms, a profound anomaly to the question of self-determination. We really need to kind of think about that. And as far as that's concerned, I guess my own thought on the matter would be that we often sometimes underestimate what is required. We sit there and certainly the previous Sikyong, for example, used to occasionally say, I'll see you next year in Lhasa. Solving this problem is to solve a larger problem about the way in which all of us live now. If you go to Lhasa, the last time I went to Lhasa, that was 2004. The last time I was allowed to go to Lhasa was 2004. If you ask what signification meant, it meant people walking around in Italian Gucci shoes and Christian Dior or or seeing Western shaving brands on things on those lines. Tibetan culture is undoubtedly dying, but the more interesting puzzle there is that if you look at, for example, Han Chinese culture, with the exception of language, it has effectively died. I remember having this argument with a Chinese party cadre about this, and he sat there and said, you know, our forms of architecture, of clothing, of etiquette, all of these things, with the possible exception of the language, have gone. We no longer have them. Now we eat in McDonald's. So the real question is, what is the larger picture that is being changed? But also there is this kind of question that what is involved in getting a genuine autonomy for Tibet is a much larger puzzle than we often think about. It's not about coming to the negotiating table. It has to be something much larger behind that. Firstly, there need to be there need to be nation building processes amongst the Tibetans to reverse many of the processes that have already gone. But the truth of the matter is, in the end of the day, if you want a genuine autonomy for Tibet, you have to transform China. And that is the larger question.
Thank you. I think that sums up a pragmatic element there very well, is that you can put the pressure on and you can, as much as you want, but you have to do something that can actually work with the Chinese Communist Party. There's a couple of questions. That one I wanted to bring into you, Martin, and the other one I'd like to bring Chris Law and the Sikyong back for. But the first one to you, Martin, is from Rimjad Sud. What's the impact of all this on young Tibetans whose thinking is less conservative and traditional about their country's future? Are they going to accept the Chinese way of life?
I think it is clear that significant social changes occurred within Tibet. You know, you can't exactly be born and brought up in the kind of world that Sikyong has elaborated on in some depth, and Chris Law has talked about. You can't possibly grow up in a world like that and be the same as if you were living in a world without all of that. That has to change. That's obviously the case. But it comes to the question of, I think, this modernization thing. I think people have always underestimated the profound cultural resilience of Tibetans. They are actually, across generations, incredibly resilient. And I remember even in 1988 being followed by a guy in Samye, and he followed in my footsteps for 8 straight miles, stepping in every sort of asking me for a photograph of the Dalai Lama. He was 19 years old. Okay, he was 19 years old in 1988, so he had seen nothing of Tibet prior to 1959. I think we have to understand here the terrifying possibility for a Westerner that Tibetan culture is legitimately attractive to Tibetans. That they actually kind of not just have a right to a culture, but that it is actually something which gives them things that really are done. So the idea that they would naturally change, they would naturally shift across towards modernization, towards all of these things. I think that's an assumption that we always need to be careful about.
Yeah. That's a very good answer, actually, sort of drills right down into it. This is from Dipsel Lama. Is there any possibility to Scotland, if it becomes independence, that they raise complete freedom from Britain? I think this brings into my thinking, and it's a question I ask a lot on Taiwan, is if Scotland got its independence, would it recognize the Parliament in exile or Tibet as an independent nation? And would Tibet, Sikyong, would it accept that recognition? Chris Law, first on that.
Thank you, Humphrey. It's a really interesting question. Like a couple of things I want to say first of all, which kind of mirrors some of the things Martin's saying. He's talking about the young generations today in Tibet, how resilient and how their experience a lot different from perhaps the parents and the grandparents, particularly in the early days of occupation. In Scotland, the campaign for independence didn't start with me or started in 2012, 2014 for independence. It started decades earlier. The SNP was formed nearly 90 years ago. So that's long before anybody in this call's memory is either. Started with 1 or 2 individuals, small group. We got 1 MP in the late 40s, and we had the first women MP in 1967. So it's taken a long time. And generations moved during that time. The point I would say is that today, young people in Scotland know their first port of call when they think about a parliament is to think about the Parliament of Scotland as opposed to Westminster. Yeah. And I say that directly because I have schools come from my constituency in Dundee down to Westminster to ask me questions about Westminster and how it works. And I always finish those sessions, and I have done since 2015. Should Scotland be an independent country? Now, interestingly, 2015, after the referendum, 1 year after, I had roughly 50-50 in the room. And incidentally, this is modern studies. It's kind of studying where we, society, culture, but politics as well in the modern democracy. The demographics, male, females, roughly 60-40 guys, right? So the majority being young men, 16, 17-year-olds. Today, and this has moved quite significantly, you have nearly 90% of the students are women. So they're interested in really engaging young women, engaging in Scotland's future. And when I asked the question today, should Scotland be an independent country? You'll be hard pressed to find someone that says no. In fact, I haven't found any for the last 2 years.
So as an independent, if you win your independence, would you recognize Tibet as an independent nation?
We recognize all nations as independent nations. We've already supported recognizing Palestine as a nation, which is again something the UK government hasn't done yet. And it's up to the people of Tibet to decide whether they want to go down the middle way or whether they want to go towards independence.
Well, that's what I want to ask the Sikyong, Penpa, Tsering now. Would you accept diplomatic recognition as an independent nation, or would that not be the middle way?
At this point of time, any acceptance is good for us, particularly that is the leverage that we need to engage with China, or for China to come on the negotiating table. But in the case of Tibet, I think the situation in Scotland and UK and Tibet and China are totally different situation, where you have an authoritarian regime. So that is why I keep telling my people we have to keep two realities in mind. One is that, of course, to seek a solution to resolve the Sino-Tibet conflict, we have to reach out to the Chinese government if we want to resolve this peacefully, in a non-violent way, in a mutually beneficial way, negotiated and lasting solution. Then that is the only way, unless China breaks up like Soviet Union and there may be opportunities for other nationalities. That is one thing. Now, otherwise, then the other thing is, till such a solution is found, we have to reach out to the international community, as I mentioned before. But then we can't expect the international community to leave aside, whether it's a nation or a group of nations. I don't think they will leave aside their national interests for Tibet, unless their national interest also aligns with the interests of Tibet. So we keep these two realities in mind and then put our expectations and make efforts. Because in Buddhism, as we say, if we have too much over expectation, then you land up in trouble, you land up in a lot of disappointment. So we don't want to land up in disappointment, even after 72 years. Many people think that a lot of Tibetans in the world, it's because of His Holiness, who has been going around the world with a folded hand, that we garnered so much support. Otherwise, we are only 130,000 Tibetans in exile. So we have to keep the reality in mind as to what is achievable and what is not achievable. And as and when circumstances changes, there may be opportunities, but that's a different matter. Right now, what is more important is to preserve the Tibetan culture. If you can imagine, the time when His Holiness started thinking about this was way back in 1973-74, when the cultural revolution was at its throes, when everything was being destroyed. Then we were wondering whether the Tibetan culture will remain or not, Tibetan religion will remain or not. So the first priority is to preserve our identity in the form of our language, culture. And we also have to look at the situation in Tibet. We have to understand China. We have to understand the international scenario and then move forward.
It sounds very much that you have got some very skillful diplomatic dancing to do, as it were, to keep all these balls in the air. Stay with us for as long as you can. Our final speaker is going to wrap the argument for us. Dibyesh Anand is the head of social sciences at Westminster University and an author of Tibet, A Victim of Geopolitics. He has argued that both Western ideas and practices are complicit in Chinese control of Tibet, and is going to discuss now this general lens that we've been talking about of colonization and China's role as a colonizing power. Dibyesh and Anand, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Humphrey, and thank you, Democracy Forum, for inviting me here. And I am glad that I'm going last because I listen to everyone and broadly agree, more or less, not all the time, with previous speakers, but I also have this task of bringing it all together and then taking the conversation further. That's the important part, right? It's not about what we discuss here, but what we do next. Now, a couple of points I'll make is, and I do agree with Sikyong here, that we are dealing, of course, there's similarities between liberation movements and colonial occupations in different parts of the world. But there's a big difference vis-a-vis China and Tibet compared to, let's say, Scotland or any other part of the world or many other parts of the world. The difference is we are not only dealing with colonial occupation, but more crucially, we are dealing with colonial occupation by an authoritarian state that sees itself as a liberationist state. So colonial occupation is common. The right to self-determination thing is common. But where China is different is that not only is it an authoritarian state, but it is an authoritarian state that is fueled by an ideology that it has liberated the people. So it has liberated Tibetans. And this is important to bear in mind because China has been very effective in convincing significant public opinion in the world and significant public opinion, of course, within China, that it is in Tibet because Tibet was always part of China, but more crucially, that it is doing good for Tibetan people. So the idea is that they liberated Tibetans from feudal occupation, they liberated Tibet from the old theocratic system. And we have to bear in mind that China has been quite effective in its propaganda and its views. And this is important to bear in mind because sometimes when we are in this kind of discussion like we are here, we broadly agree with each other. We know that China is a colonial power, we know Tibetan cause is just, but bear in mind that our views might not be the majority view. Therefore, our role, therefore, is to convince a lot more people that we are right and Chinese authoritarianism is wrong. Right? So that's I wanted to start with that. So authoritarianism is important because let's take example of British colonization of different parts of the world, or of other kinds of colonization that might take place in contemporary world. In all of that, if you have a democracy, you'll have at least a few citizens who would have some sympathy for the occupied, right? So in this case, imagine that if China was a democracy, right? If China was a democracy, then Tibetans could have some alliance with and some solidarity with a few Chinese people inside China to make the case for more autonomy or even freedom. But that's not possible because, of course, China is an authoritarian state. So let's not forget the authoritarianism part of it. Now, in 1959, the International Commission for Jurists, they talked of Chinese rule in Tibet as clearly colonial and imperial. They use the word colonial and imperial. Yet, if you look at much of knowledge production on Tibet, and I'm talking of Tibet studies, of which I'm also part, Martin are part, many of us are part. Between 1959 until today, there are very few of us, and I can tell you, there are very few of us who use the word colonization for Chinese rule in Tibet. Various reasons. There are very few people in the world who use the word colonization or colonial rule rather than simply saying occupation or military occupation. So I'm glad that in this Democracy Forum, we're using the word what it's the most appropriate, which is Chinese colonial rule. And it is important to recognize it as colonial and not simply military occupation, because military occupations are relatively easy to challenge. You have a military occupation. If military is forced to withdraw, the occupation ends. But colonization is more difficult to remove because colonization is not only about military occupation, political occupation, territorial control, control over economy, society, which is all taking place. But colonization is also about paternalism. The notion that the colonizers are there for the good of the colonized. So when British were ruling different parts of the world, they said, we are in Kenya or we are in India because Indians are backward, Kenyans are backward, and we are here to help them, liberate them. And that is the exact language which China uses in Tibet. We are here to liberate Tibetans. Now, the crucial point which I think Sikyong mentioned and others also mentioned was that is there any way in which Tibetan population can ever say to Chinese government that I'm sorry, but we never asked you to liberate us. Who are you to liberate us? And give us our right or freedom to decide whether you have liberated or not. That mechanism does not exist. And that is what makes Chinese rhetoric of liberation and Chinese rhetoric of freeing Tibetans from old feudal structure, very much colonial. And therefore, in terms of when we are waging this battle, and it is a battle, frankly, of public opinion, of public diplomacy, we have to constantly remind the world that just because China claims and China does invest in Tibet economically, just because China has built railways, etc., China is bringing some kind of modern development, right, does not imply it's not colonial, because colonization was always about not only control of the population, but also shaping the language through which occupation was seen. So presenting the colonized as weak, backward, people who need the more progressive people to liberate them, right? So in this case, China will say the Han population is the advanced civilization. They are there to help the younger brothers, the Tibetans and Uyghurs and other people. And they constantly use that language. And we have to get better at identifying that paternalism and pushing back against it. Because broadly, well, as a Tibet studies, frankly, if you ask me, I don't have much hope from it, because much of my Tibet studies scholars keep quiet when it comes to political notion of China and Tibet for various reasons. But for Tibetan movement, for those of few of the scholars who support Tibetan movement, and I'm very clear about it, whether it's middle way or Rangzen, freedom, that's for Tibetans to decide. I may have my own views, right? But I have no right to impose on Tibetan population what I think is the right view. And that I have to be very clear. But as someone who has strong solidarity with the anti-colonial struggle of Tibetan population, I would always say that let's recognize colonization, let's challenge it at every single stage while we wait for an ideal moment where empires collapse. And remember, all empires collapse one day. Fine, there might not be much hope of China collapsing or Chinese empire collapsing one day. Who knows what happens in 2 centuries or 1 century. Until then, of course, Tibetans will survive. But the battle which we can still win is the sort of opinion around the world where at the very least we make it clear that Chinese rule in Tibet is a colonial rule and not simply just another military occupation, colonial rule. Because once we shape the opinion that it's a colonial rule, can we talk of decolonization? Can we talk of anti-colonial thing? Right? That's something to bear in mind. Now, if we take example of Tibet and China relations since 1951, and I'm talking 51, not 1959. 59 is where His Holiness comes into the exile, right? 1951. Between 51 to 59, there was an accommodation between Tibetan government, the traditional Tibetan government, and China. Now, as Tibetans then knew, and as historians will tell you, that it was not actually even 1956, by the way. Even in 1951, it was very clear that China did not see that arrangement of peaceful coexistence as a long term. That was a strategic move on part of China and Communist Party of China to give some time before they consolidate militarily and politically in Tibet. Right? That was very important. They did that. So whether it's Xi Jinping time or Deng Xiaoping time or Chairman Mao time, more liberal times or not so liberal times. Frankly, the desire of PRC, desire of Communist Party of China to have complete absolute control over Tibetan population has not changed. And that's something to bear in mind, right? So the phase of colonization might change and go up and down, but it hasn't changed in terms of the desire to colonize, right? So that's important part to remember. Now, in terms of why insist on, and okay, as someone was pointing out that now what can international community do? And the one thing we have to do is, of course, and I agree with the Chrysler and also Tim Lawton, who was at my university last week. And by the way, Sikyong will be at our university, Westminster in London on Wednesday. We'll have some conversation on that. It is important to stand up to China. So once we recognize Chinese colonial rule in Tibet, and I don't need to explain how it's oppressive, other speakers have done it. What can we do to stand up? Remember, with bullies, if you give in to bullies, anyway, you're lost. But we have to stand up. Now, does it mean that it will make much difference to Chinese rule in Tibet? Maybe, maybe not. But if we do not stand up, we will definitely make it sure that what China presents as natural state of affairs then becomes natural. And the reason you, Humphrey, pointed out my work on how Western ideas also has helped China. Western ideas of sovereignty. China never had sovereignty over Tibet. Even if you look at empires based in China, the Manchu and the Yuan Empire, and the relationship they had with the traditional Tibetan state, sovereignty was not the language. Yet, sovereignty is a European language that Chinese learned much quicker than the Tibetans, and they exercise that sovereignty over Tibet, right? Absolute sovereignty. Then China insists to the rest of the world that we have sovereignty, you have to recognize us. One China, recognize us. And China has been very good and effective in that, and we have to therefore counter that on it. Again, I'll not go into how we can have solidarity, but I do want to talk of two important things. One is about role of India. India is the most important actor in all this puzzle vis-a-vis Tibet movement, not only because it's a large country, now the largest country in the world, next to China and next to Tibet. That's important. Second, while Tibetan government in exile is based in India, and I understand that Indian government has done a lot to support and allow Tibetans to function to an extent. The recent case of His Holiness the Dalai Lama, what happened vis-a-vis Indian media a decade ago when there was a similar scandal and a completely manufactured story against Karmapa, 2011 against Karmapa, and the role of different Indian agencies and Indian media there, irresponsible ones. As a scholar, I would say I'm Indian, originally Indian British. I do find that it is quite important that we recognize that the status of Tibetans in India is more precarious than what many people will be willing to accept in public. I understand Tibetan community cannot raise those questions and cannot do it. But those of us outside, we have to make sure and work with Indian civil society, Indian politicians from all different views, right, left, center, everywhere, that we have to make sure that the status of Tibetans is secure in India. It is secure while His Holiness is there. But let's say in 20, 30 years' time, we cannot take for granted the hospitality that India has provided. So we have to work together, and I think the onus is not on Tibetans, but the onus is on those who are Indians, civil society, as I said, political class in India, the media in India, and also those outside India who believe in some form of democracy in India, that we have to at least work to make sure that in the Tibetan community in India is secure and can flourish. And final point, the recent manufactured, again I'm using word manufactured, scandal around His Holiness the Dalai Lama. Those of us who have dealt with Tibet movement, those of us who are involved, we know how false the stories were. But please bear in mind, I'm someone who's very active on social media. But for a significant section of population who's not into Tibet movement, they are influenced by that clip. And therefore, rather than simply saying, oh, that was wrong, we need to counter it. We need to have to start to work to make sure that the reputation of His Holiness beyond the circle of Dharma followers and beyond the circle of Free Tibet movement is repaired. And I'm saying it repaired because my concern and my fear remains, and it is not because, by the way, I'm not a Dharma follower, I'm not a Tibetan Buddhist. For me, His Holiness is important because Tibetans who are occupied people are important. He stands for Tibet for many population. And therefore, we have to work together again to counter those kinds of negative images and also be more savvy on media and social media to counter it. We should not have to wait for 2 days or 5 days or 10 days for Tibetan media to speak out or expose how or try to argue how the images that came out were wrong, etc. Right? To summarize everything, I'm glad we need more events like this. We need to also acknowledge, and I'll say in this event, that we should try to avoid an all-male panel. I noticed that we were all men here. We should try to avoid this. We need to bring in more progressive voices, also conservative voices, all different kinds of voices. This is why I'm so hopeful when I see Chris Law and Tim Lawton from two very different political parties, but working together. Because Tibet is a cause that can bring us together. And the reason they can bring us together is because Tibet is not about the right and the left and though this is what's happening in US context. So let's avoid the toxic US left and right kind of debate here. But Tibet is a cause which is about freedom. It is about justice. And whether you're right or left, if you believe that all human beings are equal and colonization is per se wrong, the fact that it happens elsewhere, that the fact that all countries did it at one point in time is immaterial. What we cannot do is allow Tibetans, allow Uyghurs, allow other peoples controlled by / occupied by peoples of China to be left on their own, to struggle on their own and be disappeared on their own, simply because we think China is so powerful, simply because we think that who are we to tell them because we have also ourselves been wrong, etc. But that is not humanity. So going back to His Holiness's message about compassion, going back to any faith or religion or even non-religion. We are not a religious person, right? For a basic idea that all human beings are equal and therefore all human beings ought to have similar kinds of rights. We have to acknowledge that Tibetans also have the right to self-determination, and they cannot exercise that right to self-determination until they survive. And for them to survive, it is very important that we have solidarity with them. And therefore, we could speak of all kinds of freedom movements, including speak of Free Tibet. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. We do have a comment in here from Tenzing Dambol about I think the comment that you made that Tibet is under Chinese colonial occupation. It's not just colonial occupation, which is this phraseology that in the comments has been coming through in a quite interesting way. I want to ask you a question from Philip Bowman, both to yourself and to Sikyong, Penpa, Tsering. First to you, Dibyesh, Anand. From Philip Bowman, to what degree have Tibetans assimilated into Chinese culture? And is their desire for self-determination still as strong? We've touched on a bit of this, but to what extent does the government in exile and parliament in exile actually represent the views of Tibetans living under Chinese colonial rule?
A very quick, an important question, but not a fair question. I'll say why it's not a fair question. Because, in fact, sometimes Chinese students ask me similar kind of question. How do you know what's happening there? I say, well, I don't know. How do you know what's happening in China? So the onus is back on Chinese government to allow more free research, more freedom of movement, and Tibetans to express themselves whether they think the Dalai Lama and the government in exile represents them or not. The fact that Chinese state is so repressive when it comes to Tibet tells you that essentially what we are arguing about Dalai Lama still being very important, government in exile still being seen as important is a correct one, right? That's one part. Second, so repression essentially shows there's a lot of insecurity that China has, I would say. And second, again, if you look at, whatever views come out of Tibet, even when some Tibetans are following, let's say, they'll be seen as Sinicized, right? Following Chinese culture, that does not mean they're not Tibetans. So, Vosser, right? Vosser is a famous poet. Take her as an example. She'd be seen as a half Chinese, half Tibetan. But important thing is she's very Tibetan when it comes to supporting the Tibet movement, but also His Holiness the Dalai Lama. So therefore, I would say it remains very powerful. The reality of it will only be found when China is free and Tibet is free.
So China has to open up more in order to get a sense of that. Sikyong, Penpa, Tsering, what is your view of the degree that Tibetans have assimilated? Do they use TikTok and Weibo and all that sort of thing? And how can you gauge what their true sense is?
Right now, Tibet is locked down, so nobody can go in, nobody can come out. Only about 10 days ago, I heard news that some people are managing to come outside the Tibet Autonomous Region. They are now inviting traders from Nepal who have been trading with Tibet. So some movement is happening, but we still have to be very, very careful about what China is doing. So Tibet is completely cut off in that sense. You have no access. If Tibet is, as what Chinese government says, a socialist paradise, then why you don't allow foreigners or Tibetans to go into Tibet and see for themselves the socialist paradise as China describes?
Sorry to interrupt. I think the point of the question really is because we know the clampdown from China over 72 years, but what gauge do you have of the success, let's put it that way, of the Chinese Communist Party to assimilate young Tibetans into the Chinese way of life and take them away from your cause?
Now it is being forced because of the boarding schools. So students are forced to go to school, even children from age 3 to 6. We counted over the last 3 years, it has been increasing. Now it has become 150,000 Tibetans in these boarding schools from age 3 to 6. From 6 to 18 is more than 1 million. But you mentioned about TikTok, so I thought I'd take advantage of this Weibo and TikTok thing because Dibyesh mentioned about the current issue involving His Holiness and the young Indian boy. So Chinese government wanted to use that as an instance to spread this news within the Tibetan community to create uneasiness and make them not follow His Holiness the Dalai Lama. Now, you know what happened? We received message from inside China saying that whatever the explanations may be, bad things turn into good, and we inside Tibetans can see for ourselves Dalai Lama in freedom. So this time they managed to see His Holiness, but in very weird forms. It was His Holiness sticking his tongue out, and the other side was Joe Biden, because they hate the Americans so much. So they have been trying this. For a few days, they spread that, and now they have clamped down again. So they don't, Chinese government, even after 72 years, failed to understand Tibetan people's mind. So that is what is, I have always been saying, Chinese government need to understand Tibetan aspiration, and all they need is common sense in their head. So we need to do some surgery and put common sense in the Chinese leadership's mind.
I just want to go around the panel again, starting with you, and just very briefly, what is your message to the European governments that you're about to, or you're talking to at the moment? And again, you've just said, what is your message to the Chinese Communist Party to resolve this situation over Tibet? Firstly to you, Penpa, Tsering, what are your thoughts on that?
So please don't carried away by Chinese propaganda. They are very strong. They are very pervasive. But it's as one Indian leader said, communism is built on lies. So to hide one lie, they have to tell another lie, and lies upon lies. And Chinese believe that if you repeat the lie 100 times, then the lie will also turn into truth. Now, this is not the age. Everybody is more aware. It's information technology, communication, everything has improved. So you cannot tell lie to the international community all the time. And I think the international community also need to be more discerning and don't look at only those the tailored videos. If Chinese government tries to do that, please try to understand the holistic issue. Because if you don't understand the whole issue, then you may always be misdirected to take certain judgments, just like what happened during this time.
Yeah, like we heard about the golden era and the taking away of suzerainty. Martin Mills, what are your thoughts on those two? The message to the Chinese Communist Party and the message to European leaders?
Oh, that's quite a question. Message to European leaders would be the same, which it always is, I think, particularly in the cross-party group in Tibet. We did a lot of work on climate change and things on those lines. The puzzle that we face now is most politicians live within a kind of 5-year re-election cycle, and that is there now. And they always talk about what kind of Bismarck called the art of the possible in terms of that 5-year re-election cycle. I would ask and sit there and say, okay, you need to think beyond that, and it is your responsibility to think beyond that. And ask the question that says, what do you want the world to be like in 20 years or 30 years or 40 years? Okay, how do we get there from where we are right now? And this is the kind of puzzle. Everyone sort of says, oh, well, these things are not possible. We can't do them. That's realpolitik. But it's usually realpolitik within a 5-year cycle, basically. The real question, and this is what we expect of our elected politicians, is actually that they look to a future and say, what does a future for example, in this case, the Tibetan cause, what should this look like, and how do we start that process right now, right here? What do we do now, rather than worrying endlessly about the present?
Okay, thank you very much. And to Chris Law, in 20 years' time, I suppose you want an independent Scotland. What is the message to the Chinese Communist Party and European leaders?
Well, I hope it'll be sooner than that, Humphrey, first of all, in 20 years. But I think the important point I would make, very simply, one is this isn't going away. What the Sikyong said is that the spirit is high amongst young people, although their experience is different. So that's really important. I think for Scotland in its own journey, we want to be a good global citizen. And to be honest, again, going back to Sikyong about working in partnership with China, whether that's successful or not, I don't know. But you do need to work in partnership with the world. And that means sharing the things that make Tibet unique, sharing the things that are going to become policy one day, things that people aspire to, things really important. And lastly, the whole thing on the Dalai Lama sticking his tongue out, let's not forget, it was Albert Einstein on his birthday many years ago that did the very same thing. So he's up there with some of the best in the world. So that would be my message. Keep going.
Okay, thank you. And finally, Dibyesh, Anand, message to the Chinese Communist Party, message to Europe.
Communist Party, be a true communist, which implies work for all human beings, treat them equally, and end the state. Remember, the whole idea of communism is end of a classless, stateless society. So end with your state, which you have, and be actually People's Republic of China rather than Party's Republic of China. That's the message for communist parties, for them to disband themselves. And for Europe, the important idea is to, with all the flaws and all the challenges which you face, let's not forget the importance of democracy and human rights. It cannot be non-universal. We have to speak for right to self-determination and democracy here, elsewhere. And just because we have got some things wrong doesn't imply we have to keep quiet about what is happening elsewhere. Therefore, it's not about selling out. It's not only about selling out to China, but it is about speaking for and supporting and being in solidarity with all occupied people, all oppressed people, in this case, Tibetans.
Thank you very much for that. Now is the time we're drawing to the end of our Democracy Forum debate to bring in the wisdom of our chair, Barry Gardiner, MP, who, like Chris Law, sits at the heart of the British democracy, and he's steeped in the ups and downs of South Asia and Tibet. Alas, Barry is on jury service, apparently, and can't be with us, but he has given us a video analysis of how he sees this debate, having not heard it.
My apologies that I can't be with you in person today. I'm actually in court, not as a defendant, I'm pleased to say, but I've been required to do jury service this week. So I'm really disappointed that I've been unable to listen and therefore properly respond to the comments of our panelists this afternoon. But I will enjoy viewing the broadcast later. No doubt I'll find out just how ignorant and how wide of the mark my own contribution is. You do have to admire the directors of Democracy Forum for their extraordinary prescience in choosing the topics for our seminars, which they do, of course, months in advance. How could they have guessed all those weeks ago that the 31st Home Minister would announce his Vibrant Villages programme in Arunachal Pradesh just before this meeting? Indeed, how could they have foreseen that in addition to the palm and 5 fingers, Tibet would now have a tongue? It really is beyond clairvoyance. An integral and inalienable part of India is how Amit Shah described Arunachal Pradesh as he objected to China's objection to an Indian Home Minister visiting an Indian state. But China, of course, claims it is part of South Tibet and said that Shah's visit is not conducive to the peace and tranquility of the border situation. So perhaps we should remind ourselves that in 1947, India only posted 75 border police to patrol the Indo-Tibet border, which stretched all the way from Ladakh to Arunachal Pradesh. Today, China deploys nearly 50,000 soldiers to the Indo-Tibet border areas, whilst India has approximately 35,000 troops on its northern border. This military presence on the world's highest contested border doesn't come cheap. According to a CIPRO report, India's military expenditure was $71.1 billion in 2019, which ranked as the 3rd highest in the world after the US and China. And about 10% of that was specifically down to the shared border with China, the Chinese occupation of Tibet and the subsequent signing of the Panchil Agreement. Cost alone, then, would make the status of Tibet the key element of Sino-Indian relations. The demilitarization of the Tibetan plateau, however, seems much more a wish for a distant past than a realistic prospect for the geopolitical future. So let's look at the status and governance of Tibet. Historically, it's enjoyed long periods of greater and lesser autonomy. In the modern era, one looks to the communist victory in the Chinese Civil War in 1949, at which point Tibet was either invaded or liberated according to your political preference. Prior to this, the 3 provinces of Tibet had been governing their own affairs since the fall of the Qing dynasty in 1912. Central Tibet, headed by the Dalai Lama in Lhasa, Kham in the east, and Amdo in the northeast, both of whom regarded Lhasa as a cultural and religious center rather than a political one. On the 23rd of May, 1951, Mao Zedong and the Dalai Lama signed a 17-point agreement on Tibet's relationship with the PRC for what they called the peaceful liberation of Tibet. It's the only agreement between the PRC and the former government of Tibet. It appeared to ensure that Tibet would remain autonomous, but with responsibility for foreign affairs passing to China. Now, of course, the legitimacy of the 17-point agreement has subsequently been rejected by many, including the Dalai Lama, who said that, as a young man, he'd been faced with little choice but to sign it. In 1965, in any event, Tibet became the Tibet Autonomous Region, or TAR. In the 1950s, both Kham and Amdo were subjected to political and economic control from Beijing, including land redistribution policies. This included the closing and destruction of monasteries, the communalization of land, the introduction of struggles against class enemies. And it was in these regions that unrest against Chinese communist rule began, quickly spreading to central Tibet by 1957. By 1959, this became the full-scale Tibetan uprising in Lhasa by what the Chinese leadership called rebel forces. On the 10th of March 1959, resistance to the communist reforms and Chinese rule exploded into the Tibetan uprising. Over 300,000 protesters tried to protect the Dalai Lama from Beijing and called for an independent Tibet. The People's Liberation Army was sent in, and almost 90,000 Tibetans were killed. The Dalai Lama, of course, fled to India and set up the Tibetan government in exile, or the Central Tibetan Administration in Dharamsala. Now, in 2021, Xi Jinping was the first leader in 30 years to actually visit Lhasa. But the strategic value which he places on Tibet can be seen by the fact that he has published 3 white papers on Tibet in just the last 8 years. In 2013, he declared at China's National People's Congress, "To govern the country well, we must first govern the frontiers well. And to govern the frontiers well, we must first ensure stability in Tibet." So, what did she believe that stability required? The answer is social and economic growth. Historically, an agrarian economy, hard labor, working land owned by the monasteries or the nobility, Beijing began a program of infrastructure investment. In 2007, that was $13 billion allocated to projects like the Nagari Airport and improved water, electricity, rail, and telephone networks. At the 11th People's Congress of the Tibet Autonomous Region in 2021, Yan Jinhai, the acting chairman of the regional government, stated that GDP was now 32.86 billion, and per capita disposable income for the region's rural residents had grown 14%. Per capita income had now reached $9,000, and Tibet was one of the fastest growing regions in China. The composition of Tibet's economy has been totally transformed. In 1978, agriculture comprised 50.7% of GDP. By 2021, manufacturing represented 36% and the service sector 56%. Do the math. Agriculture is now no more than 8%. There's now a series of hydroelectric dams under construction along Tibet's Yarlung-Tsangpo River that will generate 60 gigawatts of power. That is triple the output of the Three Gorges Dam. And the Sichuan-Lhasa Railway is a $49 billion project linking Tibet to the economic engine of Chengdu in Sichuan province by 1,800 kilometers of electrified track that is supposed to be completed in 3 years' time. At the start of the project, President Xi said that it was about, and I quote, "maintaining national unity, promoting ethnic unity, and consolidating stability in border areas." A number of commentators have criticized these investments as cynical moves to subdue discontent amongst Tibetans by offering development and modernity. And the Free Tibet campaign, based in London, has said that they are seeking to win hearts and minds of Tibetans whilst using control and repression of religion to erase national religious identity. What we should ask is, cynical though they may be, are they working? Much more worrying is the clear evidence that where there is carrot, there is also stick. The mass labour camps in which 500,000 workers are reported to be put on training schemes to develop work discipline, Chinese language, and work ethics, as it's called, do not exactly speak of promoting ethnic and national unity, more national and ethnic uniformity. They're not the same thing. The Human Rights Foundation report 2 years ago sets all of this out in great detail, saying that Beijing wants to create a society that is perfectly molded to the ideological tenets of Xi Jinping, or what the CCP refers to as the Chinese dream of national rejuvenation, a society that is Sinocentric, socialist, and homogeneous, where religious and cultural plurality are seen as hindrances to the Communist Party's policy of assimilation. Space for genuine political participation is non-existent, despite promises of political autonomy. The government claims to safeguard national security, to eradicate terrorism, separatism, extremism, but the war against terrorism is actually used as a pretext to hamper political involvement. People are encouraged to become what they call true patriots, individuals who are fiercely loyal to the party. These policies target younger generations and aim to destroy all Tibetan cultural identity. This is backed up by the policing of religious practices to suffocate religious freedom. So let's return to Arunachal Pradesh. It will take more than Amit Shah renaming Kibitu as India's first village to counter the amassed power of China's infrastructure and investment with its harsh social and cultural repression to row back the Chinese ambitions for Tibet's palm and the 5 fingers that Beijing calls Ladakh, Nepal, Sikkim, Bhutan, and Arunachal Pradesh.
Thank you, Barry. In absentia, we have got about 2 minutes left. I would like to go around the panel very quickly. We have a question in from Zipsel Lamo. Do you think the middle way approach is an essential strategy for the future goal? Give us a yes or no answer, starting, I think the Sikyong has gone at the moment, so let's start with Chris Law.
If I'm reduced to one answer, then it's going to be no.
No. Okay. Martin Mills.
Well, it's Tibetan's choice. So that at the moment is up to them as far as that's concerned. But it's not a strategy. It is a negotiating position. The real question is, what's your strategy?
What's the strategy? Dibyesh and Anand?
No, because China sees, whether you ask for middle way or full independence, China sees as independence. Why not ask for independence and work towards that?
Ask for independence.
That's my view, but that doesn't mean said that. Yeah, definitely choose.
That's great. What a fantastic debate, insightful debate we have. We are out of time. Read more about all these issues and much more in our sister magazine, Asian Affairs. The latest issues about China, about India, going to places that most mainstream media does not touch. We are also running editorials and thoughts at the moment about whether the Indo-Pacific needs its own charter and how that might differ from the United Nations Charter. And that is going to be a big debate. We have a May webinar on May the 24th coming up. The title is China and the US Effects of Competing Hegemonies in the Indo-Pacific. I've just seen that the May 24th date is to be confirmed, but please watch out for it. Thank you for our fantastic panel for drilling down and looking at the middle way and all those various elements and extremes attached to Tibet. Thank you, Lord Charles Bruce, for so starkly giving us our backdrop. And from me, Humphrey Hawksley, and all the team at Asian Affairs and the Democracy Forum. Thank you for being here. And until next month, goodbye.